there is something you are absolutely certain of, more certain perhaps than of anything else in your experience. You are certain that you exist, that there is a you who is reading these words, a you who has a history and a future, a you who feels things and thinks things and makes choices. The sense of being a self, a continuous, unified, experiencing subject at the center of your own life is so immediate, so constant, so foundational to every moment of experience that questioning it can feel not just strange, but somehow incoherent. And yet some of the most rigorous thinking in philosophy and some of the most striking findings in neuroscience and cognitive psychology suggest that this certainty is misplaced. Not in the trivial sense that you might be wrong about peripheral details of who you are, but in the deeper sense that the thing you are most certain of, the unified continuous self at the center of your experience, may not exist in the form you take it to exist. This is not a mystical claim. It is not an invitation to nihilism or to the conclusion that nothing matters. It is one of the most important and most practically significant findings at the intersection of philosophy, neuroscience, and cognitive science, and understanding it properly, not as a reason for despair, but as a more accurate map of what you actually are, may be one of the most liberating things you encounter. Let's begin with what the self feels like from the inside. The self, as most people experience it, has several features that seem undeniable. It feels unified. There is a single you who is having all of your experiences, not multiple competing selves or a fragmented collection of processes. It feels continuous. The you who wakes up this morning is the same you who went to sleep last night. The same you who was a child, the same you who will be old. It feels like an author. You are not simply the passive observer of your life, but the agent who chooses, decides, and acts. And it feels like it has a location. The self seems to be somewhere, typically experienced as somewhere behind the eyes or in the head, a central point from which experience radiates. Each of these features, when examined carefully, turns out to be far more complicated than it first appears, and the science and philosophy of the past several decades have systematically dismantled each one. Let's start with the feeling of unity. The most powerful evidence that the unified self is a construction rather than a given comes from the study of split-brain patients. In the 1960s, the neurosurgeon Joseph Bogan and the neurologist Philip Vogel began performing corpus callosotomies, the surgical severing of the corpus callosum, the thick band of neural fibers that connects the brain's left and right hemispheres, as a treatment for severe epilepsy. The procedure was effective at controlling seizures, but it produced something that nobody had anticipated. The psychologist Roger Sperry and his graduate student Michael Gazzaniga began studying these patients systematically. What they found was startling. When information was presented to the left visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, the patient could not verbally report what they had seen because verbal processing in most people is located in the left hemisphere, but they could point to or pick up the object with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere. When information was presented to the right visual field, the patient could verbally describe it but could not recognize it with their left hand. In effect, the surgery had produced two separate streams of consciousness operating in parallel in a single body. Each hemisphere had access to information the other didn't have and responded to that information independently. The left hemisphere would confabulate explanations for the actions of the left hand that it had no knowledge of, generating plausible-sounding but entirely invented reasons for behavior that had been initiated by the right hemisphere. Gazzaniga called this the interpreter, the left hemisphere's systematic tendency to construct coherent narratives for behavior that it had not actually caused. The implications for the nature of the self are profound. If a single brain can be surgically divided into two independent streams of experience, then what exactly is the unified self that each of us takes ourselves to be? Gazzaniga's conclusion was radical. The unified self is a story told by the left hemisphere's interpreter, a narrative constructed after the fact to give coherence to the outputs of multiple, parallel, largely independent neural processes that are not themselves unified at all. This conclusion connects directly to what may be the most important philosophical work on the self of the 20th century. The philosopher Derek Parfit, in his 1984 book Reasons and Persons, argued with extraordinary rigor and clarity that personal identity. The kind of identity that makes you the same person as the child you once were does not consist in any deep metaphysical fact. It consists in psychological continuity, the overlapping chains of memories, intentions, beliefs, and desires that connect your current self to your past and future selves. And crucially, this continuity is a matter of degree. It admits of gradations. There is no sharp line at which the person you are now becomes a different person from the person you were 10 years ago or will be 20 years from now. Parfit drew a striking analogy. Nations exist, but they do not exist as something over and above the particular people, institutions, laws, and customs that constitute them. When you ask whether the Roman Empire still exists in some sense in the traditions it transmitted, there is no deep fact of the matter. There are just the various relations of continuity and influence, which can be described without invoking some metaphysical entity called the Roman Empire that either persists or doesn't. Similarly, persons exist, but they may not exist as anything over and above the particular physical and psychological processes that constitute them. The question of whether you are strictly the same person as the child in the photograph may have no deep answer because there may be no metaphysical entity called you that either persists or doesn't. Parfit found this conclusion liberating rather than terrifying. If the self is not a deep metaphysical entity but a pattern of psychological continuity, then the boundaries between yourself and others become less sharp. Your concern for your future self has the same structure as your concern for other people who will be influenced by your current choices. The obsessive self-concern that causes so much human suffering is grounded in a mistake about what you are, and recognizing the mistake, really recognizing it rather than just intellectually assenting to it, can dissolve some of that suffering. The neuroscientific evidence for the constructed nature of the self is equally striking and comes from multiple directions. Antonio Damasio's work on the neuroscience of consciousness distinguishes between what he calls the proto-self, the core self, and the autobiographical self. The proto-self is the basic neural mapping of the body's state, a moment-to-moment representation of where the body is and how it is doing. The core self is the transient sense of self that arises in each moment of experience, a brief and constantly regenerated feeling of being an experiencing subject. The autobiographical self is the extended narrative self, the sense of being a continuous person with a past and a future. What Damasio's work suggests is that none of these are given. They are all constructed moment by specific neural processes. The autobiographical self in particular is a story that the brain tells about itself, drawing on memory, current experience, and anticipated future to generate a sense of continuous personal identity. When those neural processes are disrupted, as they are in various neurological conditions, the self can be partially or completely dissolved. Patients with severe amnesia lose their autobiographical self almost entirely. They cannot construct the narrative of personal identity because they cannot access the memories that narrative requires. What remains is something like the core self, the transient moment-to-moment sense of being an experiencing subject. But the extended person, the one who has a history and relationships and projects and a future, is no longer accessible to them. Patients with certain forms of depersonalization disorder experience the disruption of the core self, the feeling of being an experiencing subject. They report watching their own lives as if from outside, feeling that their actions, thoughts, and experiences are somehow not their own, that the self that is supposed to be having these experiences is absent or unreal. The condition is profoundly disturbing for those who experience it, and it demonstrates that even the most basic sense of being a self, which the rest of us take so completely for granted that we never think about it, is itself a construction that can fail. The Buddhist philosophical tradition arrived at similar conclusions through a different path more than 2,000 years before modern neuroscience. The doctrine of anatta, or no self, is one of the most central and most distinctive teachings of Buddhist philosophy. It holds that what we take to be a permanent, unified, independent self is, in fact, a collection of constantly changing processes, what Buddhist philosophy calls the 5 aggregates or skandhas: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. None of these aggregates constitutes a self. None of them is permanent or unified or independent, and what we call the self is simply the way we refer to the functioning of these aggregates together. The Buddhist analysis is not that the self doesn't exist in any sense. It is that the self doesn't exist in the way we habitually take it to exist, as something permanent, unified, and independent. The attachment to a self that doesn't have these properties is, in the Buddhist analysis, the root cause of suffering. Because we believe we have a permanent self to protect and promote and gratify, we suffer when that self is threatened, diminished, or frustrated, and it will always eventually be threatened, diminished, and frustrated because it is not what we believe it to be. The psychologist and neuroscientist Sam Harris, drawing on both the Buddhist tradition and contemporary neuroscience, has argued that the sense of being a subject who is the author of thoughts, the experiencer of experiences, the agent of actions, is itself an illusion, not in the sense that experience doesn't occur or that actions don't happen, but in the sense that there is no unified subject behind the experience, no homunculus sitting in the theater of consciousness watching the show. Consciousness happens, experiences occur, but they are not happening to a self in the way we habitually believe. They are simply happening. This connects to what may be the most scientifically important challenge to our ordinary concept of the self, the question of free will and authorship. The feeling of being the author of your own thoughts and actions, of being the one who decided to do what you are doing, is one of the most fundamental aspects of the first-person experience of selfhood. Yet the neuroscience of volition, beginning with Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s, has consistently found that the neural processes that produce voluntary actions begin before people are consciously aware of having decided to act. Libet asked participants to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, while monitoring their brain activity and asking them to note the position of a clock hand at the moment they first felt the urge to move. He found that a brain signal now known as the readiness potential began approximately 550 milliseconds before the movement, while the reported conscious intention to move appeared only about 200 milliseconds before movement. The decision, or at least its neural correlate, preceded the conscious awareness of having decided by a significant margin. Subsequent research has refined and extended Libet's findings in various ways, and the interpretation remains contested. Some researchers argue that the readiness potential does not definitively represent a decision, and that the methodology of asking participants to report the moment of their conscious intention is flawed. Others argue that conscious intention may play a role in vetoing or modifying actions even if it doesn't initiate them. But the fundamental challenge remains. If the neural processes that produce your actions consistently precede your conscious awareness of deciding to act, in what sense are you the author of those actions? The philosopher Daniel Dennett has argued that the self is not an illusion, but rather a center of narrative gravity, a theoretical construct rather like the center of gravity of a physical object. The center of gravity of a chair is not a physical thing you can find if you look hard enough in the chair. It is an abstraction, a useful theoretical posit that captures something real about how the chair behaves. Similarly, the self is a useful abstraction, a center of narrative gravity that captures something real about how a human being behaves over time, how it maintains consistent patterns of belief and preference and behavior. It is not an illusion in the sense of being simply non-existent, but it is not the kind of entity most people take it to be either. What does it mean to understand all of this? What are the practical implications of recognizing that the unified, continuous, authorial self you take yourself to be is, at minimum, a construction and possibly something much more tenuous than that? The first implication is epistemic humility about your own inner life. If the self is a construction, if the narrative you tell about yourself is assembled from memory, current experience, and anticipated future by processes that are themselves not unified or transparent, then the self-knowledge you have is not direct observation of a stable inner entity. It is a constantly revised story that serves various psychological functions. The story may be more or less accurate, more or less helpful, more or less freeing, but it is a story, not a report. The second implication concerns the suffering that Parfit and the Buddhist tradition both identified as rooted in the illusion of a permanent bounded self. Much human suffering has the structure of a self being threatened, diminished, frustrated, or ultimately annihilated. The fear of death is the most extreme version of this, the anticipated annihilation of the self. If the self is not the kind of entity we take it to be, if it is already less bounded, less unified, less permanent, less separate from everything else than it appears, then some of the suffering generated by threats to it may be based on a mistake about what is being threatened. This is not to say that recognizing the constructed nature of the self automatically eliminates suffering. It doesn't work that way, but it may loosen the grip of certain kinds of suffering. The self that feels it must defend its reputation, protect its boundaries, guarantee its future, and ultimately resist its own dissolution is a self that is suffering in ways that may be unnecessary. The third implication is perhaps the most interesting and the most difficult to articulate. If the self is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process, if it is not a noun, but a verb, something that is happening rather than something that simply is, then it becomes possible to relate to it differently, not to identify with it as something to be protected and perpetuated, but to watch it with something more like curiosity, to notice the way it forms and reforms, the way the sense of being a particular person arises and dissolves and arises again, the way the story shifts depending on context and mood and what you have recently experienced. This is what contemplative traditions across cultures have pointed toward for millennia. Not the elimination of the self, but the loosening of identification with a fixed and permanent self. The space that opens up when you stop treating the self as a thing to be protected and start recognizing it as a process to be observed may be the beginning of something that various traditions have called wisdom, liberation, or simply a less suffering-saturated relationship to the experience of being alive. You are not the self you think you are. You are something more interesting, more fluid, and ultimately less isolated than that. What you are exactly remains one of the deepest open questions in all of human inquiry. But the certainty that you know the answer is almost certainly misplaced, and losing that certainty, really losing it rather than just entertaining it as an intellectual possibility, may be one of the most significant things that can happen to a person. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.